There is a version of Thomas Edison that America decided to believe in sometime around 1880 and has never quite let go of. The version with the light bulb held above his head, the genius in the laboratory, the tireless inventor who tried 10,000 ways to make a filament work before finding the one that changed the world. The version that appears in school textbooks and on postage stamps and in the kind of inspirational quotes that get printed on motivational posters in office break rooms. Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. He said that, or something close to it. And the quote has survived because it contains a truth about the nature of creative and technical work that resonates with people who want to believe that sustained effort is what separates the exceptional from the ordinary. The quote is true. The version of Edison built around it is not false exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter enormously. Because the full story of Thomas Alva Edison, the actual documented history of how he worked and what he built and how he treated the people who built it with him, is considerably more complicated, considerably more morally ambiguous, and considerably more interesting than the inspirational poster version. It is the story of one of the most productive and most ruthless industrial dynasties in American history. A dynasty not of blood, though Edison's descendants have maintained their connection to his legacy with considerable tenacity, but of innovation and exploitation, of genius and theft, of genuine world-changing invention and systematic suppression of the inventions of others. It is the story of the man who did not invent the light bulb, did not invent the phonograph in the way the legend suggests, did not invent the motion picture camera without significant contributions from people whose names he allowed to disappear into his own, and who built an industrial empire on a combination of real brilliance and a moral flexibility about intellectual property that makes the modern technology industry's approach to the same question look almost scrupulous by comparison. And it begins, as so many American stories of industrial genius begin, not in a laboratory but in poverty. Thomas Edison was born in Milan, Ohio, in 1847, the youngest of 7 children of Samuel Edison, a Canadian political exile who had fled to the United States after participating in the failed Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837, and Nancy Elliott, a former schoolteacher whose influence on her youngest son's intellectual development he would acknowledge for the rest of his life. The family was not destitute, but it was not comfortable, and the specific texture of Edison's childhood, the combination of financial precariousness, intellectual curiosity, and the particular American frontier culture of the mid-19th century Midwest, shaped him in ways that his later wealth and fame never entirely erased. He was a difficult child in the specific way that children of unusual intelligence are often difficult in educational environments designed for the average. His teachers found him slow, distracted, and resistant to instruction. His mind moved in directions that the curriculum did not accommodate and at speeds that the classroom could not match. He was taken out of formal schooling after 3 months, at the age of 8, and educated primarily at home by his mother, who recognized in her youngest son something that his teachers had failed to see and who provided him with access to books, scientific experiments, and the kind of sustained intellectual encouragement that formal schooling of the period rarely offered its students. By the age of 12, he was working as a newsboy on the Grand Trunk Railway, selling newspapers and candy to passengers between Port Huron and Detroit. He used his earnings to buy scientific equipment and set up a small chemistry laboratory in the baggage car, which came to an abrupt end when he accidentally set fire to it and was summarily ejected from the train by the conductor. He learned telegraphy as a teenager, after saving the son of a station agent from being struck by a runaway railway car and being rewarded with instruction in the telegraph by the grateful father. Telegraphy was the defining technology of the mid-19th century, the information superhighway of its era, and Edison's mastery of it gave him both a livelihood and an education in the principles of electrical communication that would inform everything he built for the rest of his life. He worked as a telegrapher across the Midwest and the East Coast through the 1860s, developing a reputation as one of the fastest and most inventive operators on the network, always thinking about the technology rather than just using it, always asking why it worked the way it did and whether it could be made to work differently or better. He filed his first patent in 1868, at 21 years old, for an electric vote recorder designed to speed up the voting process in legislative chambers. The device worked perfectly and was entirely rejected by the politicians it was designed to serve, who understood that slow voting processes gave them time to lobby undecided colleagues and had no interest in a technology that would eliminate that opportunity. It was Edison's first lesson in a truth that would shape his entire subsequent career. Invention was not enough. The invention had to solve a problem that someone with money was actually willing to pay to have solved. He never again invented something without first identifying the market for it. The breakthrough that launched Edison's career as a professional inventor came in 1869 when he improved the stock ticker, the device that transmitted stock market prices from the exchange to brokerage offices across the city, in a way that the Gold and Stock Telegraph Company found sufficiently valuable to pay him $40,000. $40,000 in 1869 was an extraordinary sum, the equivalent of roughly $1 million in modern terms, and Edison used it to set up his first proper industrial research operation in Newark, New Jersey. He was 22 years old. He had never attended university. He had spent the previous decade learning by doing, by taking things apart, by staying up through the night working on problems that his formal education had never introduced him to, and by developing in himself a tolerance for sustained mental effort and physical deprivation that would become the defining operational characteristic of the institution he was about to build. Because what Edison built was not just an inventor's workshop. It was something that had never quite existed before in the history of technological development. A factory for invention. A systematic, organized, industrially scaled operation whose product was not a manufactured good but a patented idea. The Menlo Park laboratory, which Edison established in New Jersey in 1876, was described by its creator as an invention factory that would produce a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. The ambition of that statement, the sheer industrial confidence of a man who believed that invention could be scheduled and delivered on demand like any other manufactured product, was unprecedented. And the fact that he came remarkably close to meeting his own production targets makes Menlo Park one of the most remarkable industrial operations of the 19th century. But Menlo Park was also the place where the complications in the Edison story begin to accumulate. Because the invention factory required inventors. And the inventors who worked at Menlo Park, the men who arrived from across America and Europe to work in Edison's laboratory, who brought their own expertise and their own ideas and their own capacity for the sustained creative effort that produced the patents that Edison filed in his own name, occupy a position in the Edison story that the inspirational poster version has never quite found a comfortable way to accommodate. They were brilliant. They were essential. And most of them have been forgotten. The men who worked at Menlo Park called themselves the Muckers. It was a self-deprecating name that carried within it a complicated mixture of pride and irony, the specific humor of people who understood that they were doing extraordinary work in conditions that were frequently uncomfortable, under a boss whose demands were relentless and whose appetite for credit was considerably larger than his appetite for sharing it. They worked shifts that routinely extended through the night. They slept on laboratory benches when the work demanded it. They ate together in the laboratory, cooked meals brought in from the outside, sustained by the specific energy of a place where something genuinely new was being created on an almost daily basis and where the intellectual excitement of that creation was sufficient, for most of them most of the time, to compensate for the wages that were modest and the recognition that was almost entirely absent. Edison drove them with a combination of personal charisma, intellectual challenge, and the specific authority of a man who was simultaneously their employer, their colleague, and the most productive mind any of them had ever encountered in close quarters. He was not a conventional manager. He did not sit in an office issuing instructions. He worked alongside his men, at the bench, through the night, consuming the same bad coffee and breathing the same chemical fumes and subjecting himself to the same physical demands that he placed on everyone around him. This shared suffering created a loyalty and a cohesion that a more conventionally managed operation would have struggled to produce. The Muckers were not simply employees. They were participants in something they believed was historically significant. And they were right. Menlo Park was historically significant. The question of who deserved the credit for that significance is where the story becomes uncomfortable. The most important of the Muckers, the man whose contribution to the Edison operation was so substantial and so systematically under-acknowledged that his case has become one of the most discussed examples of institutional credit theft in the history of science and technology, was Charles Batchelor. An English engineer who had come to America to work for a textile machinery company and had ended up at Edison's Newark laboratory in the early 1870s, Batchelor was the operational genius who translated Edison's conceptual ideas into working physical reality. He had the hands, the precision, the experimental discipline, and the mechanical intuition that Edison's more conceptual and less manually precise intelligence required as a complement. Their working relationship was one of the most productive partnerships in the history of invention and one of the most unequal in terms of how the products of that partnership were attributed and rewarded. Batchelor worked at Edison's side through the development of the phonograph, the carbon microphone, the incandescent light bulb, and dozens of other devices that the Edison operation produced in its most productive years. He was not a passive assistant. He was an active contributor whose specific technical solutions were integral to making devices work that had previously only worked in principle. And yet the patents that resulted from this work were filed in Edison's name. The public credit went to Edison. The financial rewards accrued primarily to Edison. Batchelor received a salary and a small equity stake in some of Edison's companies that made him comfortable but nowhere near wealthy, and he received essentially none of the historical recognition that his contributions warranted. He died in 1910, his name known to specialists in the history of technology and almost nobody else. Batchelor was not the only mucker whose contributions were absorbed into the Edison legend without adequate acknowledgement. John Cruzy, the Swiss machinist who built the first working phonograph from Edison's rough sketch in 1877, and who is recorded in the historical accounts of that day as having expressed genuine disbelief that the device would work, is remembered primarily as the man who built the machine rather than as one of the men who made it possible. Francis Upton, a Princeton-educated mathematician who provided the theoretical foundations that Edison's more intuitive and less mathematically rigorous approach required, particularly in the development of the electrical distribution system that would eventually become the commercial product of all the lightbulb work, is known to historians of the period but absent from the popular account of Edison's achievements. The pattern was consistent and it was structural. Edison's operation generated patents, and the patents were Edison's, and the history that followed from the patents was Edison's history, and the men who had contributed to the work that the patents represented were the workers in a factory whose product was not theirs to claim. The lightbulb itself is the most instructive example of how the Edison legend was constructed and what the construction left out. Edison did not invent the incandescent lightbulb. This is not a controversial historical claim. It is the documented consensus of the history of technology. Incandescent lighting had been demonstrated by Humphrey Davy in 1802. Warren de la Rue had created an incandescent bulb using a platinum filament in 1840. Joseph Swan in Britain had been working on a practical incandescent lamp for decades and had demonstrated a working version in January 1879, several months before Edison demonstrated his own version in October of the same year. The question of whether Edison's version was sufficiently independent of Swan's work to constitute a separate invention was contested legally and diplomatically, and eventually resolved through a business arrangement rather than a legal judgment, with Edison and Swan merging their British operations into a joint company called Ediswan. What Edison actually did with the light bulb was something that in some respects was more impressive than inventing it, and in other respects was more morally complicated. He solved the practical problems that had prevented incandescent lighting from being commercially viable. The right filament material, which turned out to be carbonized bamboo after thousands of experiments with other materials, many of them conducted by the muckers working through the night on systematic programs that Batchelor organized and oversaw. The right vacuum inside the bulb. The right electrical resistance. And then, most importantly, the thing that no previous inventor of the incandescent bulb had thought to provide. The system. The entire electrical infrastructure required to make a light bulb useful. The generator that produced the electricity. The cables that distributed it. The meters that measured consumption. The switches and fixtures and fuses and all the other components of an electrical distribution network that would allow a light bulb in a house or a factory or a street to be connected to a central power source and turned on and off at will. This was the genuine Edison genius. Not the device in isolation, but the system around the device. The recognition that a light bulb without an electrical grid was a curiosity rather than a product, and the organizational and technical capacity to build the grid alongside the bulb so that both were ready for commercial deployment simultaneously. The Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan, which Edison opened in September 1882 and which was the world's first commercial electrical power station, supplying electricity to 85 customers and 400 light bulbs in a small area of Lower Manhattan, was the proof of concept for an idea that would eventually electrify the world. It was an extraordinary achievement. It was also built on the labor of men whose names are not on the plaque. And then came Tesla. Nikola Tesla arrived at Edison's operation in 1884, having crossed the Atlantic with a letter of introduction from Charles Batchelor that said, in its entirety, "I know two great men and you are one of them. The other is this young man." Tesla was 28 years old, Serbian-born, educated at the finest technical institutions in Europe, and possessed of a theoretical understanding of electrical engineering that was in several respects deeper and more sophisticated than Edison's more empirical and less mathematically grounded approach. He was also, As would become apparent over the following months, working on ideas about alternating current electrical systems that were in direct competition with the direct current system that Edison had built his entire commercial operation around. Edison hired Tesla and put him to work on improving the direct current generators that were the heart of the Pearl Street operation. Tesla worked with the characteristic intensity that Edison valued and produced improvements that Edison acknowledged were significant. And then Tesla raised the subject of payment. He had been promised, or believed he had been promised, a bonus of $50,000 for the generator work. Edison's response, recorded in accounts that Tesla provided later in his life and that Edison never directly contradicted, was that Tesla had not understood American humor. There was no $50,000. There had never been a $50,000. The promise, if it had been made, was a joke. Tesla resigned. He spent the next year digging ditches in New York to survive while he developed his ideas about alternating current independently of Edison, and eventually found in George Westinghouse the commercial partner who would help him deploy those ideas against the direct current empire that Edison had built. What followed, the War of Currents, was one of the most consequential and most revealing industrial conflicts of the 19th century. And it showed a side of Thomas Edison that the inspirational poster version has always struggled to accommodate. The side that, when faced with a genuine technical and commercial threat, was willing to do things that went considerably beyond the normal boundaries of competitive business practice into territory that can only be described as a sustained campaign of deliberate public deception conducted at the cost of innocent lives. The War of Currents began as a technical argument and became something considerably uglier. The technical argument was genuine and consequential. Edison's direct current system and Tesla's alternating current system were not simply competing products in the way that two brands of the same commodity compete. They were fundamentally different approaches to the problem of electrical distribution, with different strengths, different weaknesses, and different implications for the shape of the electrical infrastructure that the industrializing world was about to build. The outcome of the competition between them would determine not just which company made more money, but how electricity was generated, transmitted, and consumed across the entire developed world for the next century and beyond. Edison's direct current system had the advantage of being first. It was proven, commercially operational, and backed by the financial resources and institutional relationships that Edison had spent a decade building. Its disadvantage was physical. Direct current could not be transmitted efficiently over long distances. The voltage dropped as the distance from the generating station increased, which meant that a direct current electrical system required a generating station every mile or so in urban areas and made rural electrification essentially impossible. The Pearl Street station in Manhattan served a radius of roughly 1 mile. To electrify all of Manhattan would have required dozens of generating stations, each representing a substantial capital investment, each requiring ongoing maintenance, each consuming coal and producing smoke in the middle of a densely populated urban area. Tesla's alternating current system solved this problem through the transformer, a device that could step voltage up for long-distance transmission and step it back down for safe use at the point of consumption. Alternating current could be generated at a central location, transformed to high voltage, transmitted over long distances with minimal loss, and then transformed back down to usable voltage at the point of delivery. A single large generating station could serve an entire city. The implications for the economics of electrical infrastructure were enormous. Alternating current was not just technically superior for most applications. It was commercially superior in a way that would become increasingly obvious as the scale of electrical deployment grew. Edison understood this. He was not a stupid man, and he was not ignorant of the technical arguments. The evidence that he understood the technical case for alternating current and chose to fight it anyway, not on technical grounds but through a campaign of public manipulation and deliberate misrepresentation, is one of the most damning elements of the Edison story and one of the most consistently minimized in the popular account of his career. The campaign Edison mounted against alternating current was organized around a single argument that he knew to be misleading. Safety. Alternating current, Edison argued publicly and repeatedly, was inherently more dangerous than direct current. The higher voltages required for long-distance transmission made it more likely to kill people who came into contact with it accidentally. Direct current was the safe choice. Alternating current was the deadly one. This argument had a kernel of technical truth. High-voltage alternating current was indeed more immediately dangerous than the low-voltage direct current that the Pearl Street station delivered to its customers. But the comparison was dishonest because it compared Edison's low-voltage distribution system with the high-voltage transmission lines of the alternating current system, ignoring the fact that alternating current was stepped down to safe voltages at the point of consumption and that the actual household voltages of the two systems were comparable in their danger levels. Edison did not stop at argument. He moved into demonstration. Harold P. Brown, an electrical engineer with no previous public profile who appeared on the scene in 1887 and whose financial relationship with Edison's organization has been a matter of historical debate ever since, began conducting public demonstrations of the dangers of alternating current by using it to electrocute animals. Dogs were obtained, sometimes purchased, and sometimes acquired through methods that the accounts of the period describe with careful vagueness, and publicly electrocuted using alternating current generators in demonstrations that Edison's laboratory hosted and that the press was invited to attend. The demonstrations were reported widely. They were exactly as lurid and disturbing as they were intended to be. And they made the argument that Edison wanted made, in a register that technical papers and public speeches could not match, the visceral register of watching something die. The demonstrations escalated. Larger animals. Calves. Eventually a circus elephant named Topsy who had killed 3 men and was scheduled to be destroyed by her owners, and whose 1903 electrocution using alternating current was filmed and distributed as a short motion picture that Edison's company produced and circulated. The Topsy electrocution was not part of the original War of Currents, which had been commercially resolved a decade earlier, but it was conducted using Edison's film technology and distributed by Edison's company, and it demonstrated that the impulse to use the suffering of animals as an argument against alternating current had not entirely left Edison's operation even after the commercial battle had been lost. Because the commercial battle was lost. George Westinghouse, backed by Tesla's patents and by the financial resources of his own considerable industrial empire, fought the war of currents with a combination of technical confidence and commercial patience that eventually prevailed over Edison's more aggressive but less technically grounded campaign. The decisive moment came in 1893 when Westinghouse won the contract to illuminate the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the World's Fair that drew 27 million visitors and demonstrated alternating currents capabilities to an audience of unprecedented scale. And then in 1895 when the Niagara Falls Power Station, designed by Tesla and built by Westinghouse, began transmitting alternating current electricity to the city of Buffalo 20 miles away, demonstrating beyond any reasonable argument that the long-distance transmission that Edison's system could not provide was not just theoretically possible but commercially operational. Edison never publicly conceded that he had been wrong about alternating current. He maintained for the rest of his life a public position that amounted to a refusal to engage with the evidence that the war of currents had produced. Privately, the people who knew him best suggested that he understood perfectly well that the technical decision had gone against him and that the campaign he had mounted had been motivated by commercial interest rather than genuine safety concern. His laboratory eventually began working with alternating current systems without public acknowledgement that this represented a change of position. The man who had electrocuted dogs to argue that alternating current was too dangerous for public use quietly incorporated it into his own operations when the commercial logic made continued resistance impractical. The human cost of the war of currents extended beyond the electrocuted animals. In 1890, Harold Brown, working with equipment from Edison's laboratory, designed the first electric chair, which was installed in Auburn Prison in New York and used for the first time on August 6 of that year to execute a man named William Kemmler who had been convicted of murder. The electric chair used alternating current. This was deliberate. Edison's campaign had succeeded in convincing the New York state authorities that alternating current was the appropriate technology for execution, which was intended to permanently associate it in the public mind with death. The execution of William Kemmler was botched, requiring 2 applications of current and taking several minutes longer than anticipated, in circumstances that witnesses described with a horror that the newspapers reported in detail. The execution was a public relations disaster for alternating current only in the most temporary sense. Within a decade, the technical and commercial arguments had been settled decisively in its favor regardless. What remained, after the war of currents was over and the alternating current infrastructure was being built across the world, was the Edison legacy. And the Edison legacy is one of the most complicated artifacts in the history of American industrial culture. The genuine achievements are extraordinary. The phonograph, the practical incandescent light bulb, and the electrical distribution system that made it commercially viable. The motion picture camera and the infrastructure of the early film industry. Over 1,000 patents filed in his name across a career that spanned 6 decades. The Industrial Research Laboratory as an organizational form, the invention factory that systematized the production of innovation in a way that every subsequent corporate research and development operation has drawn on whether it acknowledges the debt or not. And alongside those genuine achievements, the systematic appropriation of the contributions of the men who worked in his laboratories. The campaign of deliberate public deception conducted against a superior technology for commercial reasons. The treatment of Nikola Tesla, one of the most gifted electrical engineers in the history of the field, in a manner that combined professional exploitation with personal contempt and that left Tesla to die in 1943 in a New York hotel room, alone and largely broke, while Edison had died 12 years earlier, celebrated as America's greatest inventor and wealthy beyond any reasonable need. The relationship between those two outcomes, the celebrated wealthy Edison and the forgotten impoverished Tesla, is not simply a story of two men with different temperaments and different abilities to navigate the commercial world. It is a story about what the industrial system of the late 19th and early 20th century rewarded and what it punished. It rewarded the man who understood that controlling the narrative around invention was as important as the invention itself, who understood that patents were weapons as much as protections, who understood that public perception, managed aggressively and without excessive concern for accuracy, was a commercial asset of the first order, who understood, in other words, that the business of invention was a business, and that the rules of business applied to it with the same force that they applied to steel or oil or any other industrial commodity. Tesla understood electricity better than Edison. Edison understood power better than Tesla. And in the world they both inhabited, power was the thing that mattered. The Edison dynasty did not end with Thomas Edison's death in 1931. It continued in the institutions he had built, the companies that bore his name or carried his organizational DNA, the General Electric Company that had emerged from the merger of Edison's electrical interests with those of his competitors and that became one of the most powerful industrial corporations in American history. It continued in the patent system that Edison had used so aggressively and that his successors deployed with equal aggression to control markets and suppress competition in ways that the antitrust authorities of successive generations have challenged with varying degrees of success. And it continued in the story. The light bulb above the head. The genius in the laboratory. The 1% inspiration. Because the greatest invention of the Edison dynasty was not the phonograph or the light bulb or the motion picture camera. It was Thomas Edison himself. The carefully constructed public persona of the tireless American inventor, the self-made genius from Ohio who changed the world through hard work and imagination, was the most durable and most commercially valuable product that Menlo Park ever produced. It has survived the historical scholarship that has complicated every element of it. It has survived Tesla's rehabilitation and the war of currents and the documented accounts of the muckers whose contributions it absorbed. It has survived because it tells a story about American genius and American possibility that America has always needed to believe, and that no amount of contrary evidence has been sufficient to dislodge from the place it occupies in the national mythology. Thomas Edison did not invent that story alone. He had help. He always had help. He just never found a way to acknowledge it that the inspirational poster could accommodate.